And you can follow me on any of the social media. I'll be posting the slides afterwards, so there'll be a few URLs that I'm mentioning. You could take screenshots, but I'll be posting the URLs as part of the deck after the session as well, so don't worry about capturing all those details. So enough about me. Let's talk a bit about humor. And we're not going to do the stand-up comedian type of deal. No, we're going to talk about human-operated ransomware. So that's a flavor where there's some human in the loop doing investigations, doing intelligence gathering, maybe steering the process as part of their ransomware attack and deployment, encryption, and so forth. So when we're saying humor, this is the human-operated ransomware in this context. And if you look at what Microsoft has been saying in their most recent digital defense report, then the human-operated ransomware attacks are up by a lot. And I think everybody can see that if you're following along the news, if you're reading websites, if you're checking into social media, the attacks are up and up, and certainly Microsoft is saying the same thing. Now, this is not a big enterprise company problem only. This is something that can hit you, that can hit smaller companies, mid-sized companies. In reality, ransomware operators really don't care about how big you are. It's about trying to get in. And so from the defense report, you see that Microsoft is saying 70% of organizations encountering human-operated ransomware had fewer than 500 employees. And that's typical because who has the money to spend on digital defense? Certainly if you're smaller, that's going to be a burden for the company as a whole. Now, what are things you should care about? Well, password-based attacks, identity attacks are still a big thing. They are still spiking last year, and they will keep spiking because, and we'll talk about that, that is, of course, the new control plane. And then another information nugget from the Digital Defense Report, 80% of all compromises originated from unmanaged devices. So some machines that we did not have in management, maybe they weren't in scope, we had just deployed them, maybe some admin left them there. So unmanaged devices and management as a basic hygiene factor is still a really big thing. Now, when you do get hit with ransomware, you're going to have damage. Damage in the sense that that app, that server, that infrastructure, the company IT infrastructure as a whole will be hit. Maybe something you need to rebuild or consider rebuilding. So there will be direct damages. You'll have probably financial damages because you're losing income. You're probably, your company has come to a standstill, so you'll have real damages from a revenue perspective. But one of the interesting perspectives is that it really matters how you communicate and how you handle such a situation, because certainly from this stat alone, consumers will look at you, they will assess you, and they're actually preparing to ditch you as a brand if you're not communicating well, if you're not handling well. So damages are going to be all over the place, and even the intangible damages will be a factor. Now, who could be coming after your company and you as an infrastructure? Well, I would say there's a few categories you could bucket those actors into, and it's by no means a limited set, but this is something to consider. So the first category I would say is some sort of individual. Could be a teenager, a digital native, grown up in a world where computers are the de facto standard. They're quite proficient in what they're doing, maybe brought up with gaming, and they learn about things. So maybe playing a game with a friend, they're losing, and they learn how to call up things like a botnet and send lots of traffic to a friend so that their internet connection gets burdened. They drop out of the game so that I can choose to win. And most will just, like Troy said, stay on the right path, but some will use their skills, of course, to break things or, like we saw in the keynote, do even worse things. But if you look at a threat profile for a company, such a lone wolf might not be your biggest priority. They could still cause a lot of damage. In Holland, we saw in 2018 that the banking system was clogged for about half a day because one teenager from the south of Holland was sending lots of DDoS traffic to all of the internet-facing banking portals. But in reality, this is probably not going to be on top of the list of the things that you need to worry about. But they are there, and those individuals could grow out to have capacities to do well, but they could also grow up to do bad things. This would be teenagers, individuals, lone wolves. The second category would be the financially motivated groups. And I would say the name already says it. They're in there for the money. It is an economy. They are quite successful at this point, so probably lots of people involved, lots of money going around. These are the groups we worry about. Those get into the news, like Black Cat or etc. And those are the ones that do a lot of damages. Now, it's not one group. It's going to be ransomware as a service, and we'll talk about that in a second. So many groups involved, from initial access brokers, people writing algorithms, encryption methods and toolkits, people that running a service desk to capture the money from you. So lots of groups in play to cause real damages as far as ransomware goes. And then the third category, I would say, are the nation states. And that's a big and a hard problem to tackle. Probably something you can't do without some sort of government assistance, some of the intelligence services that help defend our country and our companies that are critical. But those nation states have almost unlimited amounts of money, unlimited amount of people to realize their motives. And the line blurs a bit between those financially motivated groups and those nation states, because some of those groups present themselves as loyal to a certain nation state and do the dirty work as part of their engagement. So these are groups to worry about. The third category, really something that you can't cover on your own. We need to have support from our intelligence services. So what are some of the motives they have? Well, for the individuals, for the teenagers, the script kiddies, it could just be fame. Like, I've brought down the internet banking system. Maybe the brain hasn't matured yet. They're a teenager, so they think it's a good thing, but in reality, they're causing a lot of problems. It could be revenge, again, from those individuals, but also financially motivating groups attacking other parties. It could be financial, of course, about the money solely. It could be about a political reason. Certainly when you're crossing over to the nation states, there could be a political reason to now at this point display stuff about the Palestinians or the Israelis or whatever conflict they want to tie themselves to from the cyber world. It could be intelligence gathering, certainly from a nation state, trying to understand your intellectual property, steal that as part of their own cause. And it could be destruction, and we'll talk a bit about cyber war in a second, but certainly nation states are using cyber weapons to destroy targets in a virtual world. Now, there has been a lot of evolution over the last, I would say, decade and a half. Because if you rewind, if we go back in time for early 2010s, then how would we look at ransomware or attacks in general? Well, we would consider that they were targeting individual systems. So one server at a time. They were probably shooting with hail, if you will, trying to find gaps in infrastructures, but they would end up at one server, maybe compromise that server, but it would have a narrow impact. It would probably not be a catastrophic or business disruption altogether. And were they using encryption? Really depended on what methods they're using, on what operating system they landed, on what server or app they landed, if whatever they were using applied. So if they hit a certain Windows Server version, it could. If you had an older or newer version, the encryption might not even kick off. So encryption could be there, but it could also not be there. And how would we do our defenses? Well, typically like an enterprise antivirus deployment, right? You'd have malware prevention that would help us. The things we already knew, the heuristics, the signatures would help safeguard us from the known attacks. And so that as long as you updated your antivirus and anti-malware, you probably were safe or at least felt safe. And that's how we were rolling in the 2010s. Now, fast forward to today, that's going to be a different game, and we're all seeing that, probably spending a good amount of time to tackle this, but these human-operated ransomware gangs are trying to target your company as a whole. They're trying to bring down your business so that you are in them to pay. And they're doing it by customizing the attack. The gathering intelligence up front, trying to understand who works there, what are the technologies you're using, how could we try and, as focused as we can, compromise your infrastructure as a whole. And there's some human in the loop. So they're doing careful intelligence gathering as part of their reconnaissance. And then when they are entering your infrastructure, it's probably a calculated, focused, and specific data encryption that they're using. Something for Linux, something for Windows, something for a certain app. So very customizable for whatever they're finding in your infrastructure. And it is guaranteed to cause catastrophic and business disruption. You're going to have a business down situation, most likely. So how should we defend? Well, in part, it's hard. A lot of things you need to do. So you need to have a holistic, full approach to do that. It's not going to be enough to just do malware. It's not going to be enough to do network security. You're going to go from API management to endpoint protection to CASBs. Lots of things that need to play together to have as much bumps in the road, if you will, to stop them in their track. So today we're spending more money and time, hopefully as a holistic approach to get this done. Now, when they do get in, they have two, sorry. Now, when they do get in, they have two ways to try and get you to pay up to them. And something we call the double extortion. So first, of course, the most visible thing you would see is that they're trying to encrypt your infrastructure so that the servers stop running, that you can't access your data anymore, and that you have a business down situation. They display a ransom note and they ask you, contact us and pay us this amount of money, and then we'll give you a decryption key. But before they activate the encryption, typically they'll try and find the things that are most sensitive in your infrastructure and for your environment. What's the recipe for your product? What is the, I don't know, plans you have for buildings or chips, if you're manufacturing chips? What's your intellectual property that you care about that shouldn't come into the hands of a competitor or another country, or has sensitive data about patient records, etc., where you're really considering it as something that shouldn't be out in the open. So they often copy that before they run the encryption. That's something we call exfiltration. They copy the most sensitive data out of your infrastructure into some sort of place they own. And then even if you consider not paying for decryption and a decryption key, they say, okay, then how about this? If you don't pay us, we'll release this information to your competitor, to the stock market, to another country before this time tomorrow, noon, let's say, so you have about 24 hours to pay. So this is something we call double extortion. So they have two ways to really put you in a way that you need to pay money, which is really hard.
You hear a lot of rumors doing this job, and one of them that just keeps coming up is that hackers are making a killing from secret payments by major companies. But what would you do if every computer in your office was hijacked by hackers? That's what happened to a Norwegian company recently, and they faced a dilemma: to pay or not to pay. The hackers attacked here late at night. Computers everywhere changed simultaneously. The message: pay us or you'll be locked out forever. For this aluminium producer, it was a disaster. Down here on the factory floor, where these heavy-duty machines are working hand in hand with people, every minute counts. You can see why the hackers wanted to target a place like this. Everything was affected, even the computer inside this clock. And it wasn't just here, it was at the company's 170 other sites around the world. 35,000 employees forced to use pen and paper. In most sites, production was kept going just about, but it's this person's job to decide what's coming in and what's going out. And of course, without the computer, they had no idea. 5 weeks on, they're still recovering.
So this is just a clip from the BBC News from a Norwegian company. But I think if you look at your news, if you look at YouTube, there's many of these examples where companies get hit, production lines come to a standstill, businesses disrupted, you get this ransom note, and probably now in a panic mode. That's why a lot of these cyber companies do tabletop exercises, really to understand like what's the context you'll be operating in once you do get hit, because it's going to be stressful. There needs to be communication involvement, the board involvement, legal, there's going to be damages, continuity teams that need to get things going. So it's really going to be a stressful situation where you're in. And the question you really do need to ask yourself then is, should I pay ransom? And that is a hard question to ask and a hard question to answer. Is there a guarantee that you'll get a decryption key? Probably not. What's moral about interacting with criminals? So do you want to interact with those criminals and really support the ecosystem for them to do more attacks? Now, if you do pay the ransom, it's an interesting fact that they now know that you're in the game and willing to pay. And this is a post from Thales, a France company, who was hit first in 2021, paid for the decryption key, they got it and got back out of the woods. But then about a year later, they got hit again by Lockbit and now posting a second time, like, we know that you're willing to pay. You haven't put your defenses up wholly over the past 12 months. So now we're extorting you again. So it's a bit of an incentive, if you will, also for these parties to come back and understand that you're willing to pay. Now, from the statistics we have in the Netherlands, we see that 4 out of 10 companies pay. And that is a hard statistic because it means we're still supporting this quite a bit. That's for them about the money, so we're sponsoring them to do more attacks. But we do understand the stress. It's a bit where a company is looking at this as a business case. Either I pay, I don't know, a couple of $100,000 to get a decryption key, as opposed to rebuilding, lost revenue, weeks of interruption. So they're really often considering this as a business case. And there are individuals actually willing to transact for you. We see individuals, freelancers, actually in between cyber companies, in between companies that get hit, and those parties that negotiate on your behalf, pay the bitcoins they need to try and get you the decryption key. Now, if you're interested in how these things go, the Financial Times has built a simulator. You can use it as a free tool. It's on ft.com, but I've used the short URL, and again, it's going to be in the deck afterwards. But you can sit on the end of a customer, a company that was hit, and respond from a CIO perspective or from an engineer perspective. Or you could be on the other end, on the attacker end. And based on the answers you give and the choices you make, you can actually see how these things go along. You need to pay more, time shortens, stress comes by, etc. The double extortion, really interesting thing to do. But for them, it's really just only about the money. Even if you're in a high-stress situation, even if you're critical for a company or for a country, like a healthcare provider, they just don't care about what happened to you, what's interrupted. They care about getting the money. And this is a real screenshot from a healthcare provider in the UK that was gracious enough over the last year to share it, where they're trying to explain to the attacker, like, we're being hit and it's impacting lives of real people. And they're trying to explain again the business case of it's probably better to pay us and you'll be back in a sec. So yeah, this is the things you'll encounter as part of a ransomware attack that might be happening to you. Now, they found recently, and this was from about October, November last year, they found a third way almost to extort you. And this is when you're stock market driven. You need to disclose information as part of that you're listed on the stock market. You have a fiduciary duty. Black Hat, one of the biggest groups that is, actually filed a complaint to the American SEC telling this stock-listed company is not disclosing to you and to the market that we've hit them, we're extorting them, and we want money from them. It should be out in the open. To, again, try and force the company to pay up. And this has been almost ridiculous ways that, that they're now trying to extort you. So these are real things happening in the real world at this point. But again, it's not going to be one group. We consider this whole group of ransomware gangs to be a ransomware as a service economy. There'll be initial access brokers that will sell you a package of usernames, password, an IP address where an RDP port is open. There'll be gangs providing you with toolkits to run encryption or do discoveries. There'll be people executing attacks. There'll be people collecting the funds, again, based on their specific professional capabilities. Now, this report from Microsoft says that they've seen out of 2,500 organizations that get targeted, for which initial access was sold and they're trying to get in, about 60 really encountered activity associated with known ransomware attackers. So they got in at some point. Out of the 60s, they were successfully compromised, so they're in your environment, they're doing discoveries, they're trying to figure out what are intellectual properties you care about. And then out of those 20, one org really gets a ransomware business down situation. So that's a worrying statistic. 1 out of 2,500 gets a proper business down event. And there are many, many countries, companies around the world, of course. So these are things that, that worry me quite a bit. Now, they change their methods over time. It's not going to be one method, again, because they probably procure some sort of toolkit, some sort of mode of operandi. So if you look at a group that was previously called Devo 504, in the beginning, early 2021, they were using Ryuk toolkit to compromise parties, switch to Revil, switch to Black Mat, switch to Black Matter, switch to Conti, and then by the end of 2021, they were using Black Hat software. And at this point, Black Hat is also the #1 most dangerous, damaging, and flexible ransomware group today. The statistics is that they've caused already over 1 billion in lost corporate revenue. So Black Hat is becoming a group in and by itself, but they're also selling their means to other groups as part of the operation. And then the interesting part is part of the infrastructure was taken down about 2 months ago by law enforcement, but apparently not the full infrastructure. They've been quite resilient, and now they posted a note themselves that they have unseized themselves and are continuing about 80% of their 80 to 90% of the infrastructure again. So this is really a group that's quite professional. Again, lots of money going around, lots of people probably involved. So these are really professional parties. But it's hard to identify because, yeah, we're in a digital world. I can install a Chinese keyboard and try and mimic a Chinese operator. I can procure Black Hat software and do like the Black Hat group. So attribution is hard. You see one thing, but the reality could be another thing. That's why attribution is not very easy to do. Luckily, we have big vendors like Microsoft, and I know Roberto Rodriguez is actually here this week at NDC Security, should follow his session, who have an intelligence center. So Microsoft has something called Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, Mystic, and they can take the learnings from their platforms, from Azure, from Microsoft 365, from all of the customer data that you submit back, but also from working with intelligence services that work with them to understand the things happening in the world and attribute them, write them up, and share them back as threat intelligence to us, and of course to the products that Microsoft is providing. And one of the things they're doing all end of year, mostly around October, November, is publish something they call the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. And it summarizes some of the key factors that they've been seeing. And one of the things that is in the Digital Defense Report for 2023 is that 40% of nation-state attacks is targeting critical infrastructure. And that's why, for instance, the European Commission is now mandating a new, it's not a law, but a rule called the NIS2, where by October of this year, companies that are deemed critical or important for the country should have a base level of security applied for their infrastructure. Otherwise, board members will be personally liable, etc., etc. So there's good things coming from the EU there. But if you look at Microsoft and what they're tracking from activity, it are the countries that typically are also doing the damage in the real world. So it's going to be Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, etc., etc. But there's also going to be the financially motivated groups, like we talked about, with the cyber mercenaries that get hired as part of the nation states, and some of the influence operations. And about a year ago, March 23, you saw that Microsoft's trying to standardize naming. So instead of the DEF 0504, they're now categorizing these groups into certain buckets with certain names. So groups out of Russia will become something Blizzard, out of China something Typhoon, and the financially motivated groups are now called something Tempest. So for instance, last month there was a write-up about Octo Tempest, and based on that they're hoping to get some sort of industry naming going, so we don't have all of these weird names, but something that hopefully makes a bit of sense as part of these weather system naming. Now this is a worry to us as companies, individuals, professionals trying to defend ourselves, but if you saw the tweet from the UK, they're saying ransomware incidents now make up the majority of the emergency prompting their response. So not floods, not all of these physical things. The cyber attacks are now taking up the most times as part of the British government emergency responses. Now there's been one government, one country that's actually doing something interesting. Let's have a quick look.
Mark Dreyfus and I announced with the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday that we're setting up a permanent standing operation, a partnership of new policing between the Australian Signals Directorate, which are the cyber guns of the Australian Public Service, and the Australian Federal Police. This is an entirely new model of operating for these two organisations. What they will do is scour the world, hunt down the criminal syndicates and gangs who are targeting Australia in cyber attacks and disrupt their efforts. This is Australia standing up and punching back.
So this is interesting. Australia is now the first government saying we'll go on the offensive. If you're trying to hit us as a country, hit our companies, our important infrastructure, if you're a financially motivated group, we'll come after you and we'll actually go on the offensive to see if we can hit you back or hit you before you do an attack. It's pioneering in a world where things are changing rapidly, but it'll be interesting to see how this goes. They're dedicating about 100 people to do this, so we're following closely to understand what Australia is doing as part of not just sitting and waiting, but going on the offense. And we can all understand it because because we're in the digital world, all of these important and sensitive companies help us build our country. And that's why we see that we have the fifth domain of warfare at this point, not only sea, land, air, space, but there's going to be a fifth dimension, which is a cyber war. And we've all seen examples like Stuxnet in Israel or in Iran, where allegedly Israel and the US were behind it. But we also saw it in 2014 when Russia invaded already Crimea, the peninsula of Ukraine, and they first tried to deploy some wiper malware as part of hitting the energy distribution nets before going into the Crimea with the physical warfare. And we see that now, again, Microsoft is doing a lot of write-ups about this, what they're seeing from the CERT UA and from their own telemetry, is that Russia, in this case, is trying to do destructive cyber attacks on Ukraine as part of last winter's campaign. And if that's successful, they reach their goal. If not, then almost immediately a rocket follows. So this is real, and this is hitting a lot of the critical infrastructure for them, potentially also our own. Now, MITRE is a place where you could go and try and understand like which groups are there, what are the tools they're using, what is applicable to my industry, what threats should I worry about. They are a non-profit organization. They're trying to describe all of these actors, techniques, tactics, and tools. They're almost becoming the de facto standard. If you go into Microsoft tooling, other tooling, or write-ups at blogs, you do see a lot of references back to them, often the T numbers, where it's a certain specific article they've published. And they have attack matrices for enterprise, so your office environment, for ICS, so that's going to be a SCADA, factory, industrial networks, for mobile, for cloud environments. And you could map yourself back and understand, as part of all of this kill chain phases, what are the things that might be occurring in my infrastructure. And there's about 12 kill chain phases they describe. The initial access, getting into your infrastructure. Discovery, trying to find out what's in the environment. Executing some sort of malware on an endpoint, etc. Going into lateral movement, etc. All the way down to impact, where impact is they're pulling the switch, running the encryption, and displaying the ransom note. Now, there's a lot of information there, lots of articles that might help you. And you can't be in 2024 without mentioning AI at least once, so here we have it. No, just kidding. Roberto Rodriguez, who's actually here this week, wrote a GPT, now one of those things you could publish on ChatGPT, put in all of the attack and MITRE information, and now you can use natural language to talk to MITRE and say, hey, could I have a bar chart of the top 10 techniques of the most common groups? It will analyze for 30, 60 seconds approximately, and then give you information. But you could also ask, like, what are the most prevalent attacks for my industry? What has been the #1 attack technique for the last year? I don't know, whatever makes sense to you whenever you're doing threat profiling. So the attack GPT is something that is really valuable. I've used it quite a bit already. So kudos to Roberto for building this. And again, the URL will be in the deck. Otherwise, find it in the GPT store coming up. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about timeline and tactics. And we often see a lot of news about, oh, there's a new 0-day, we should worry about it, it's probably going to hit us if we don't defend against this already. Well, typically, we already see that you still need to fix the basics. There's so many stuff that still needs to be done before you start worrying about 0 days, because if you look at initial access, you think it's going to be some sort of 0-day, but typically it's going to be this server on an edge network where RDP is open without second factor, or like we saw with the digital defense report, some sort of unmanaged machine that was the initial access vector into your environment. So start with the basics first. But if you want to understand, like, what are the ways for attackers to gain initial access, I would say there's about 5 categories you could worry about. First category would be exploitable vulnerabilities in internet-facing services. So some sort of app on the internet where there is a CVE you could exploit, and that could be their jump host into whatever's next. And I've published the T numbers next to it, so you could look it up afterwards and find the MITRE attack articles with more information. Second category, abusing internet-facing authentication mechanisms. So Azure AD, or Entra ID, I should say at this point, Okta, some proprietary thing for your app, but something that was exploited because multi-factor wasn't there, or some password was leaked, or whatever happened there, but they exploited the authentication mechanism. Third is phishing, still a really big problem, certainly spear phishing, where they're deliberately targeting you as a person in your company, in your context, trying to get some sort of malware execution going, or as part of an attack in the middle, and we'll talk about that in a second. Fourth, physical means, getting into your warehouse, setting up a Raspberry Pi between your label printer and the network, whatever they do to gain physical access to a network and have that as part of their initial access. Or supply chain attacks. And that could be twofold. It could be, let's say, your managed security or service provider that has accounts in your infrastructure to do some admin work. They get breached. could be an entry point, or the software side where you're using some sort of NuGet package, an open source package, some sort of software coming into your network, and are we really checking if that's a good package, if it's curated, if it doesn't contain something malicious. So supply net checks are actually on the rise. But the majority of ransomware attacks start with the identity. Of course, because it is the new control plane, it's going to be our authorizations, our access methods. The pandemic accelerated remote work, so lots of ways now companies pushed for more identities. You're going to have these supply chain attacks, identities from MSPs and other people in your company. And how many times do we check rights and access? It's one of those things that often hasn't been controlled yet. So often too many rights and access to accounts. So these are things to really worry about, for sure. Now, if you look at Entra ID, Microsoft published, again, in the Digital Defense Report, they're seeing over 250 attempts per minute for things like password spray attacks, etc. So these are things that, that if you don't take care of them, will really hit you as a boomerang. But again, spear phishing is still a big thing. Based on human-operated ransomware, they found who you are, what your role is, company branding, who your suppliers are, etc., etc. And they're doing targeted phishing, so spear phishing. And you're seeing emails like this: hey, I've got a sharing link for you, here's an invoice to assess. And oftentimes, they're trying to get, of course, for you to click on a link. And they're exploiting human behavior. So typically, what spear phishing works best? Well, a coworker that says, schedule a meeting for tomorrow, click here for some options. Or some social media post, have you seen this cat picture? Ha ha ha. So the social exploit is really there. And it's accelerating, of course, and Troy said it with AI coming up. Like, we could all be master phishers by the fact that we have tools now to mimic branding, to get some good texts going, to really make something that tailors for your organization with things like ChatGPT or some other large language model. But again, the whole reason is for you to click on a link, something we call an adversary in the middle attack. As a professional, we might see it. It's a different URL, something smelly about it. But for a regular user, they might not see it. They get some sort of copy of the regular authentication page. They enter their password. It's captured, but it's sent through to the original authentication, so it is still valid, and you get your MFA response, etc. Now, if you want to know how this works, John Hammond has a really nice 20-minute video on YouTube about Evil Nginx. And if he can do it in 20 minutes, you can do it in 20 minutes to just set up these proxies, copy an authentication page, and really mimic like you're entering credentials onto the right page. But then your questions could say, okay, well, I've got MFA configured, so I don't care. They still need to get by MFA. Well, up until about a year and a half ago, we just got these types of screens, right? Approve or deny. And if you weren't logging in, you might deny it. But then they do the second attempt. Okay, it's still not valid, deny it. But a regular user, by the time we've got a 10th or an 11th request, it's becoming annoying. And they go like, okay, I'll approve this, and then it goes away. And by that time, of course, we've got a cookie, we've got something to work with. So this is what we call MFA spamming. Just try and get as much MFA responses in so that the user at one point just clicks approve to get rid of this annoyance. And it is proof that it works because the Uber attack, the Okta attack last year are the ones where they actually used server desk account through attacker in the middle, MFA spamming, and got a cookie to work with. And this is not just only for companies. If you look at the CERT of Ukraine, they also see spear phishing happening for their operators, for their critical infrastructures, to get some sort of malware execution going, probably from originating from Russia. So how would the timeline look like? Well, you've got the initial access. They're doing some sort of spear phishing. They have you clicking through the adversary in the middle attack. They're trying to do some MFA spamming. And at that point, if there's one approval, they've got something to work with. Next up is some sort of persistence. They need to enroll themselves from a device or a virtual device they have, change the MFA settings, and list them in Entra ID, for instance, and then persist on the infrastructure you have. So on an endpoint, on a server, maybe through really simple basic things still with scheduled tasks or executing SSH or getting some sort of Cobalt Strike daemon going, which is a C2 framework. And again, this is a matter of minutes by the sheer reason that they automate themselves as well. They've done the intelligence, they know largely what you have in your infrastructure, they've got these toolkits, this is not going to be manual, they're rapidly accelerating through all of these phases of the cyber kill chain. Next up is moving in and about your environment through lateral movement. Simple things like RDP or tools like Impacker to mimic certain protocols. Remote execution with PSExec to get some sort of remote service creation. So unless you've got zero trust, segmentations, whatever, they're probably roaming around in your infrastructure, trying to find credentials in memory or enabling things like WDigest on Windows servers, volume shadow copy and NTDS util just to get some sort of credentials out of those boxes. And then evading basic malware protection, basic antivirus by things like anti-rootkit drivers. And so unless you have some fancy EDR tooling, this might be a simple step for them just to come by. And then again, before we start the encryption, before we start to display the ransom note, exfiltrate out the data that you care about through processes like SCP that was masqueraded as LSAS with a single S, so it looks almost familiar. And then boom, 52 minutes after initial access, encryption starts, ransom note displayed, and it's going to be a business down situation. This is typical. This is really typical. So question, how much time does it take to encrypt about 100K files? And median server, median time, median processor, don't detail me too much, but who says it's going to take 8 hours to encrypt about 100K files? Okay, nobody. Anybody want to go for 3 hours? No? 21 minutes? It's half. Everybody's like, it's going to be 21 or 4 minutes? Okay, brave ones. It's going to be 4 minutes. And just in an example, this is going to be multi-threaded, this is going to be parallel, this is not going to be serial, it's not going to be one machine at a time, it's going to be all your machines at all times together. So a lot of encryption going on, and quickly are they progressing to a point where there's a point of no return and your business is down. And that's what Microsoft is saying as part of the Digital Defense Report. Destructive human-operated ransomware breach to full encryption and business down on a median time is 47 minutes. And that's why there's not a lot of time. And this is without countermeasures, without defenses, plain vanilla environment. But 47 minutes is not a lot of time, certainly not if you're getting a first response maybe after 15 or 30 minutes. So enough scare, what can we do about it? Let's talk about defensive recommendations. Well, if 61% of the attacks start with authentication and identity, you should probably start with your identity and start securing those. There's lots of things that vendors have, like Microsoft and Entra ID, for password protection or identity protection, where they're looking at anomalies and outliers and giving you, irregular logins and blocking those potentially, if you will. But certainly make sure that MFA is configured. And luckily now, as of May 2023, we're all going into something we call number matching. Why? Because it takes away the fact that they can just click on approve. They need to get into the Authenticator app, they need to type in the number, and they need to see the number in some sort of way for it to enter, which really makes MFA spamming a non-vector going forward. It does burden the user a bit more, but those are the reasons why Microsoft is mandating number matching as part of the multi-factor authentication rollout. If you're using Active Directory on-prem, and I guess 100 out of 100 companies do, look at those. Microsoft has a lot of great solutions where you could actually use Microsoft Defender for Identity to connect to your domain controllers, look at the directory services, but also look at the certificate services and start to understand traffic, start to understand anomalies and outliers, but also things like honey tokens. So a certain account that is not used for anything in your infrastructure looks like a regular user, but whenever they're doing enumeration, discovery, as part of their reconnaissance, they will hit that honey token and it will be 100% alert that you should follow up with. So MDDI helps. And of course, we need to get up from malware to some sort of endpoint protection. And so MDE is something to consider. That's different from malware heuristics and signature. It's also looking at in-memory processes. It's also figuring out what is normal, what is abnormal. And those are the things that get reported back or even blocked if you've had it setting up for block. For your cloud environments, look at things like Microsoft Defender for Cloud, where it can assess not only the things happening, but also attack paths. Like from this server that has RDP open, we can get into some sort of VNet and we can get into some sort of repository, give you some sort of attack path you could follow along. But the main strength we see with these types of vendors, and certainly with Microsoft, is combining all these signals back into one place. Because if we've got 27 tools for a holistic security and we've got 27 consoles, we're not going to be on top of our game. We really need to make sure that we get back to one place where we're integrating this. And that's why they're calling this XDR, Extended Detection and Response, where all of these products are working in concert together to combine information. And the great thing is, certainly with the Microsoft products, it's then mapped back to things we understand. The MITRE attack phases, for instance, you see the ones that are triggering, the T numbers, so information on the attack happening, but also aggregating things across the kill chain. Not only from a text perspective, but also from a graph perspective. So being able to investigate, find timelines, do actions, block users, block endpoints are things we can do visually, cognitively, as we do as humans. So that's the Defender and XDR suites. That can cover a lot. Identities, on-prem, for the cloud, cloud environments, endpoints, all the OSs, Windows, Linux, what have you. Now, if you want to extend that, if you have OT environments, so your factory, some sort of processing location, if you want to combine it with network data, if there is custom apps you worry about, if you have use cases you want to develop, or you've got SIEM SOC suppliers that are using that want you to use a SIEM, then something you could consider is Microsoft Sentinel. Microsoft Sentinel allows you to plug in the Defender data as one of their backends, but extend it with all of the connectors we talked about. There's about 300 that you could loop in. And again, with the whole reason to just get one single pane of glass to understand what's happening in your environment across the kill chain, not only for Microsoft worlds, but for AWS, for GCP, Google, again, for competing products, Oracle, SAP, what have you. So those are things that they would provide. Now, you're still working with a lot of data there. If you're seeing an attack, you might have questions as a professional, as an analyst, or your security provider might ask questions like, who's been impacted? Has this occurred more? What is the timeline? What are the typical next steps? What are those things that we need to ask ourselves to solve this problem, assess whether it's a true positive, and whether or not we want to block something or respond to it. So Microsoft is coming out with an integration called Security Copilot. It uses those large language models we already see today in ChatGPT or Office Copilot, but now integrated into the security products, so Defender, Sentinel. And in line with the data you're using today, you can ask those questions. So you could say, what is this script doing? Is it malicious? What endpoints are it using? What URLs? Or all of the other questions I said. So this is something that will make Microsoft software certainly a unique proposition going forward. It's expected to come into preview somewhere later this year. But the real challenge is, if we've only got 47 minutes, there's not a lot of time. Maybe our SOC provider already spends 15 minutes to get the first triage in, only 30 minutes left. So we're coming to a point where, because attackers are using automation, because they're also using AI, they're progressing quickly, we need to get to a point where we're also defending at machine speed with our automations, with our AI. And it's relatively hard because you always see that we work off one incident or one alert where we say we've got this irregular login. Somebody is now logged in from Oslo, but maybe it's me traveling here presenting today, and that's why I'm having an irregular login. So working off one incident or alert leads to a lot of false positives. And you see in a SOC typically lots of burnouts, lots of problems, because a tsunami of alerts for which probably 99% is a false positive. Why? Because it's only one source and we're not getting the context. We're not understanding why I'm here. So maybe I need a second source from my VPN or some other geolocator or from my endpoint or from whatever app I'm using. So typically we see when you're adding context, e.g. multiple sources combined, 2, 3, 4 sources combined, the false positive rate goes down, we get better results, and then we get better confidence that we can also respond at a machine speed, because now we have 2 or 3 indicators telling us this is true, and we'd like the machine to step in. And those could be things where you say, okay, it's very uncommon for this server to run this process. It's very uncommon for it to encrypt, literally never done in its life. And now we see this process asking 100,000 files to encrypt. I'd like the EDR software to step in, block it before it happens, then raise an alert for an analyst to look at, but have the damage contained before it happened. And that's what Microsoft is trying to do with the feature they call automatic attack disruption as part of the Defender XDR suite, where they're trying to, across the kill chain, get to a point where they're combining 2, 3 or more sources into a very high fidelity event where we could fully confidently say, block this, stop this before damage happens and before we get business down. And it means that we need to have confidence stitching those things together, but that's going to help us going forward. Other high confidence things that help in this regard is a feature that's called deception, where it's using AI to understand what is your server naming, what is your network IP address naming, what are the file names or users you're using. And virtually in memory, it's creating replica objects. It's saying, okay, I've got a Maarten 2, I've got a John 3, I've got Eliza 4, that we're now displaying in memory. And whenever an attacker is doing enumerations, discoveries, trying to do something, it will hit those deceptions. And again, like with a honeypot, it's 100% hit for something that's non-production, and it's most likely to be something malicious, so we can stop it and contain it in its track. This is something, again, coming out in the next probably couple of months as part of the Microsoft Defender for endpoint first, as some of the deception and decoys, leading up to a high fidelity event, allowing us to better do our defenses. So, key takeaways. Well, if you're interested in more of these stories about groups, about attack vectors, etc., follow Kevin Beaumont. He's a former Mystic analyst who writes up quite a bit about these things on his blog called doublepulsar.com. He's also on Threads and X and what have you. And he has lots of interesting facts. For instance, over the last quarter, ICBC Bank, International China Bank, Boeing, DP World, the shipping containers in Australia, etc. So follow Kevin if you want to know more. I want to conclude with saying threats are accelerating. That is not a surprise to anybody. So have a plan, but start with the basics, please. Those are the things that really matter. Secure your identities, look at your perimeter. Get visibility with some sort of XDR, with SIM. And if you're considering Microsoft, they have a wonderful Microsoft Learn where you could learn things and do a trial. If you're interested in the best practices and running Defender or considering Defender, we wrote a book about it. You can download it for free as a PDF, but I've got 3 hard copies with me. So come over if you want to grab a book for the best practices for deployment. And lastly, there's a podcast series called the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Podcast. They discuss an operator, a group, a certain country, and they're talking from the Mystic analysts, so something I enjoy a lot, something maybe to consider if you're interested in this. So, yeah, I would say we're no longer securing computers, we are securing society, and thank you so much for listening.